Chapter I. The Visitor with the Ashen Gloves. In glancing back over the many singular adventures which I shared with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes during the latter years of the 1880s, there are certain affairs which stand apart by reason not merely of their danger, but of the peculiar impression they left upon the mind. Some were remarkable for the ingenuity of the criminal, others for the extraordinary faculties displayed by Holmes himself. Yet among all those curious episodes, none remains so vivid in my memory as the strange business of Ravenswood Hall. Even now, after the passing of years, I find it difficult to separate the tangible facts of the case from the oppressive atmosphere in which they unfolded. There was about the affair a brooding sense of decay and hidden malice, a feeling that the very stones of that ancient manor concealed secrets too dreadful for daylight. Holmes himself, who rarely allowed emotion to interfere with reason, admitted more than once that the case exercised an uncommon influence upon him. It began, as many of our adventures did, during a bleak evening in Baker Street. The November fog had descended heavily upon London, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and cloaking the gas lamps in trembling yellow halos. A cold rain whispered intermittently against the windows of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. While Holmes lounged in his armchair beside the fire, his lean fingers pressed together, and his eyes half closed beneath drooping lids. To the casual observer he might have appeared idle. I knew better. The Persian slipper containing his tobacco hung from the mantelpiece. Upon the chemical table near the window stood several test tubes emitting faintly unpleasant odours. Holmes had devoted the earlier portion of the evening to an obscure experiment involving cigar ash and certain mineral compounds, the results of which appeared to satisfy him immensely, though they remained wholly incomprehensible to me. For my own part, I sat opposite him with a medical journal upon my knee, though I confess my attention wandered frequently from its pages. There are moods in which Holmes radiated such intensity of thought that the atmosphere of the room itself seemed altered by his presence. Without opening his eyes, he spoke suddenly. "You have entirely abandoned the article, Watson." I looked up in surprise. "You observe that?" "My dear fellow, you turned the same page 3 times within 10 minutes. Furthermore, your expression suggests irritation rather than intellectual engagement. The author is either pompous or inaccurate." I laughed. "He is both. A tiresome paper on tropical fevers, by a man who has plainly never encountered one." Holmes gave a faint grunt of approval. Nothing is more dangerous than theory divorced from observation. He rose abruptly and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain with long, nervous fingers. "The fog thickens," said he. "London becomes almost medieval under such conditions. Crime flourishes in weather of this sort. It emboldens weak men and shelters desperate ones. You speak as though villainy were a species of fungus. In many respects it is." He was about to continue when Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a salver. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes." "At this hour?" said I, glancing toward the clock. "Nearly 9:30. Mrs. Hudson lowered her voice. "He seems in a terrible state, sir." Holmes' eyes brightened instantly. "Excellent. Pray show him up." A moment later our visitor entered, and I confess that his appearance struck me with immediate force. He was a tall man, perhaps 50 years of age, though anxiety had carved such deep lines into his features that he appeared older. His clothing was of excellent quality, but badly disordered. As though hastily donned, rain glistened upon the shoulders of his dark overcoat, and in one hand he carried a broad-brimmed hat crushed almost out of shape by nervous handling. Yet it was not these things which most arrested my attention. The man wore a pair of pale grey gloves stained darkly at the fingertips, and his face possessed that peculiar ashen hue which I had observed only among those suffering profound shock or terror. Holmes motioned him toward the fire. "You have come from the northwestern districts," said he calmly. "Your journey was delayed. You have eaten nothing since midday, and you are in immediate fear for your life." The stranger stared. "Good God!" Holmes waved a languid hand. "The yellow clay upon your boots is peculiar to certain streets near Paddington, where recent excavations have occurred. Your cuffs bear traces of railway soot. The tremor in your right hand indicates exhaustion aggravated by hunger. As for fear, his keen eyes flicked toward the gloves. Few men crush their hats in that manner unless under severe mental strain. The visitor sank heavily into the chair I had placed for him. I was told you were remarkable, Mr. Holmes, but this exceeds. Names are generally more useful than compliments, said Holmes dryly. The man passed a shaking hand across his brow. Forgive me, I am Edmund Blackthorne of Ravenswood Hall, in Norfolk. At the mention of the estate, Holmes' expression altered subtly. Ravenswood Hall, he repeated, an old Jacobean property near Blackmere Heath. You know it, only by reputation. A house associated with several unfortunate deaths over the past century, if memory serves. Blackthorne gave a hollow laugh. Yes, the country people call it cursed. Holmes settled once more into his chair, steepling his fingers. And you, Mr. Blackthorne, do you believe in curses? The man hesitated long enough for the silence itself to become significant. I did not, said he at last, until 3 nights ago. The wind moaned suddenly down Baker Street, rattling the panes. I observed Holmes glance sharply toward our visitor, for there was something in the man's tones which transformed the commonplace words into something genuinely unsettling. Holmes leaned forward. Proceed. Blackthorne drew a folded handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his brow. My elder brother, Reginald Blackthorne, died under extraordinary circumstances. A physician attended him? Yes, Dr. Felton of Grimshaw Village. And his verdict? The man swallowed. Heart failure. Holmes remained silent. But the condition in which my brother was found, Blackthorne continued, lowering his voice, has convinced everyone at Ravenswood that something evil stalks the hall. Details, said Holmes, sharply. Blackthorne stared fixedly into the fire. My brother was discovered in the Old West Gallery shortly after midnight. The candles had burned almost completely away. Every window was locked from within. There were no marks of violence upon him. Well, he had died with an expression of absolute terror upon his face. I could not help shifting uneasily in my chair. Holmes' features remained impassive. That alone scarcely suggests the supernatural. No, whispered Blackthorne, but upon the wall above his body there was the mark. Holmes' eyes narrowed. What mark? The man moistened dry lip before answering. A raven, drawn in blood. The room fell silent, save for the hiss of rain against the windows. Holmes rose without a word and crossed slowly to the mantelpiece. Selecting his pipe, he filled it with deliberate precision before speaking. And this symbol possesses some significance connected with your family? Yes. Blackthorne's voice had sunk almost to a whisper. For generations there has existed a legend at Ravenswood Hall. It is said that whenever death comes unnaturally to the master of the house, the raven appears. Holmes struck a match. Charming, said he coolly, and no doubt the servants have embroidered the tale magnificently over the years. You think it nonsense. I think, said Holmes, exhaling smoke thoughtfully, that human beings exhibit a lamentable tendency to prefer superstition over reason. Blackthorne gave a sudden violent shudder. I pray to heaven you are correct. Holmes watched him closely. You have not yet explained why you fear for your own life. The man's eyes darted toward the window as though expecting some dreadful face to materialize beyond the fogged glass. Because yesterday evening, he essayed slowly, I found the same mark upon my bedroom door. Even Holmes appeared momentarily arrested by this declaration. You are certain? Blackthorne pulled at his gloves with trembling fingers. I attempted to convince myself it was some cruel jest. Yet this morning another event occurred. He hesitated. My brother's valet disappeared. Disappeared. Vanished entirely. His room had not been slept in. His belongings remain untouched. No one has seen him since the night of Reginald's death. Holmes paced slowly before the hearth. Who inherits Ravenswood Hall? Blackthorne looked startled. I do. Ah. There was such quiet significance in Holmes' tone that I glanced sharply at our visitor. He flushed visibly. You cannot suspect. My dear sir, said Holmes, I suspect everyone until evidence eliminates them. It is the beginning of reason. Blackthorne half rose from his chair in agitation. Then you refuse to help me. On the contrary. Holmes smiled faintly. The case promises to be extremely interesting. The man sank back with evident relief. You will come, if Watson agrees. Certainly, said I, though not without inward misgiving. Holmes turned to me with amusement in his eyes. You perceive, Watson, how indispensable you have become. The British Empire itself may perhaps survive without me, but not without your revolver and notebook. Blackthorne managed a strained smile. There is one thing more, said he quietly. Yes? The night before my brother died, he told me something which at the time I dismissed entirely. And that was? Blackthorne stared into the fire with haunted eyes. He said he had heard wings beating in the West Gallery. Holmes's pipe paused midway to his lips. Wings. A raven's wings. At that instant, a sudden gust of wind swept down the chimney, scattering sparks across the grate. The effect upon our visitor was extraordinary. He sprang half from his seat with a muffled cry. His face drained of what little colour remained. Holmes observed him narrowly. You are a man upon the edge of collapse, Mr. Blackthorne. Watson, some brandy, if you please. As I crossed toward the sideboard, Holmes stood motionless beside the fire, his sharp aquiline features illuminated by the flickering flames. There was in his expression that cold brilliance which always appeared when some problem of unusual complexity presented itself. A raven marked in blood, said he softly. A vanished servant, a frightened heir, and an old house upon a lonely heath. He smiled very slightly. Yes, said Sherlock Holmes. I think Ravenswood Hall may prove worthy of investigation indeed. Chapter 2. The warning in the fog Holmes was never so alive as when confronted by a mystery which resisted ordinary explanation. By the time our visitor had finished his account, the languor which had characterized my companion throughout the evening had entirely vanished. His thin face had sharpened into alertness, and there was about him that nervous vitality which reminded me of a finely tempered blade suddenly drawn from its sheath. Edmund Blackthorne remained with us for nearly another hour, during which Holmes subjected him to one of those relentless examinations which often left even innocent clients feeling as though they had narrowly escaped indictment. No detail appeared too trivial for Holmes' consideration. What precisely was your brother wearing when discovered? A dark dressing gown. The condition of the candles? Nearly burned to their sockets. The weather? Storming heavily. The servants? Movements. One by one they retired shortly after 11. Your own whereabouts? In the library until perhaps midnight. Holmes absorbed each answer without comment, though from time to time observed him make brief notes upon a scrap of paper which he afterward thrust carelessly into the pocket of his dressing gown. At last he rose abruptly. You will remain in London tonight, Mr. Blackthorne. The man blinked in surprise. I had intended returning immediately. That would be extremely unwise. You believe I am truly in danger? Holmes fixed him with a penetrating gaze. I believe someone wishes you to think so. Whether the danger itself is genuine remains to be determined. Blackthorne seemed dissatisfied by the ambiguity of this statement. Yet he nodded, reluctantly. There is an hotel near Charing Cross, which I occasionally use. I shall stay there. Excellent. And until we arrive at Ravenswood Hall, you will speak to no one concerning your visit here. You suspect espionage. I suspect human nature, said Holmes, which is considerably more dangerous. When at last our client departed, carrying with him directions for the morning's arrangements, Holmes remained standing motionless beside the fire for several minutes after the outer door had closed. Then, with sudden energy, he seized his violin from the corner and drew the bow violently across the strings. The resulting note was so discordant that I winced. Really, Holmes? Precisely, Watson, said he. The entire affair is discordant. He began pacing rapidly about the room, the legend of the raven, the blood mark upon the wall. A conveniently vanished servant. Every element is theatrical, almost excessively so. You think the curse merely a fabrication? My dear fellow, all curses are fabrications. The question is not whether the supernatural exists at Ravenswood Hall, but who profits from encouraging belief in it. He stopped suddenly before me. What is your impression of Blackthorne? He appeared genuinely frightened. Undoubtedly. You doubt his honesty. Holmes smiled faintly. I doubt everyone's honesty. It is one of the few habits which has preserved my usefulness. He resumed pacing. Observe the inheritance. The elder brother dies. The younger inherits. That alone demands scrutiny. Yet Blackthorne volunteered the fact without hesitation. A point in his favour. He hardly struck me as a murderer. Most murderers do not. I settled deeper into my chair. You perceive more in this matter than you admit. Infinitely more, said Holmes quietly. He crossed toward the chemical table and lit another lamp. The gloves, the ash stains upon the fingertips. Did you notice them? I assumed tobacco. Not tobacco, lamp soot. Well, Holmes leaned lightly against the table. A curious thing for a country gentleman who claims to have travelled in haste from Norfolk, especially upon both hands. I considered this. You mean he handled machinery? Possibly. Holmes' eyes drifted toward the window, beyond which the London fog pressed thickly against the glass, or something else entirely. For nearly an hour afterward he remained absorbed in thought, occasionally jotting memoranda, or consulting one of his numerous indexes. At length, sometime after midnight, he announced his intention of visiting the archives of the British Museum early the following morning. To research Ravenswood Hall. To research ravens, said he. Seeing my expression, he laughed softly. You underestimate symbolism, Watson. Criminals are often creatures of vanity. When a man selects a theatrical method, he frequently reveals more than he intends. You truly believe the blood mark significant. I believe it deliberate, which is not the same thing. At 10:30 the next morning we found ourselves seated opposite Edmund Blackthorne, within a first-class railway carriage bound toward Norfolk. The weather had deteriorated further during the night. Heavy clouds rolled low across the countryside, and a relentless wind swept the barren fields beyond the windows. Holmes, wrapped in his long travelling coat, spent most of the journey in silence, occasionally glancing through notes he had compiled from his researches. Blackthorne appeared scarcely less agitated than on the previous evening. He started repeatedly at ordinary sounds, and several times cast nervous looks behind us. When the train paused at intermediate stations. You expect pursuit? Holmes asked suddenly. The man gave a start. No. You continually examine the platform whenever we stop. Blackthorne attempted a smile. I suppose my nerves are unsettled. Quite. Holmes closed his notebook. Tell me, Mr. Blackthorne, did your brother possess enemies? None that I knew. A man of agreeable disposition? The hesitation preceding the answer was slight, but Holmes noticed it instantly. My brother could be difficult, said Blackthorne carefully. In what respect? He mistrusted people. Reasonably? I cannot say. Holmes studied him thoughtfully. Was he popular among the tenants? Not particularly. Generous? No. Temperate? Blackthorne shifted uncomfortably. Reginald enjoyed cards and drink perhaps more than was prudent. Holmes leaned back. A useful sketch. I observed our client's hands tightening upon his gloves. You make him sound monstrous. Not monstrous, said Holmes calmly. Merely human. By late afternoon, we reached the small rural station of Grimshaw, where a single carriage awaited us near the rain-swept platform. The driver, a stooped fellow, wrapped to the eyes in a heavy coat, touched his cap uncertainly upon recognizing Blackthorne. Afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, Peters. The man's gaze shifted uneasily toward Holmes and myself. Bad business at the hall, sir. So I have heard repeatedly. Peters lowered his voice. Folk are talking strange things. Holmes stepped lightly forward. Indeed, and what things might those be? The driver glanced about before answering. They say the ravens come back. Blackthorne muttered something impatient under his breath, but Holmes appeared intensely interested. And when was the raven last said to appear? 20 years ago, sir. Before old Master Elias died. In what circumstances? Peters crossed himself unconsciously. Found dead in the lake he were. eyes wide open, something dreadful. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "A family tradition of dramatic deaths," said he. The driver lowered his voice still further. "They say no Blackthorn dies peaceful at Ravenswood." "An encouraging prospect," Holmes murmured. We entered the carriage, and soon the little station vanished behind us as we travelled deeper into the countryside. I shall never forget my first glimpse of the land surrounding Ravenswood Hall. The road wound for miles across desolate heathland, broken only by twisted trees and stretches of black water glimmering beneath the overcast sky. The landscape possessed a savage melancholy unlike anything I had previously encountered in England. Even the villages through which we occasionally passed appeared subdued and ancient, their inhabitants watching our carriage with unmistakable curiosity. Blackthorn spoke little during the drive. Holmes, however, remained keenly attentive to every detail. "You observe the absence of birds," he remarked quietly. I looked about. Now that he mentioned it, the silence was indeed remarkable. "No crows," Holmes continued. "No rooks, curious for such country." Blackthorn shifted uneasily. "They avoid the hall." Holmes smiled thinly. "Birds are seldom governed by folklore." Twilight had nearly fallen when the carriage at last turned through a pair of immense iron gates flanked by crumbling stone pillars. Beyond them stretched a long avenue lined with ancient yew trees whose interlocking branches formed a dark tunnel overhead. At the far end, looming against the storm-heavy sky, stood Ravenswood Hall. Even Holmes uttered a low sound at the sight of it. The manor rose vast and sombre from the surrounding moorland, its weather-darkened stone scarred by centuries of wind and rain. Narrow windows gleamed faintly like watchful eyes. Several sections of the structure appeared considerably older than others, giving the impression that generations of Blackthorns had expanded the house without regard for symmetry or grace. A single tower dominated the western wing. Blackthorn noticed my gaze. "The west gallery lies there." Something in his tone caused an involuntary chill to pass through me. As we approached the entrance, the great front doors swung open before us. An elderly butler descended the steps with grave formality, though I could not fail to observe the strain upon his lined features. "Welcome home, sir." "Thank you, Marcham." Blackthorn gestured toward us. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson." At the mention of Holmes's name, the old servant's expression altered perceptibly. Hope mingled with apprehension. "You have come about the master's death, sir." "We have." Marcham lowered his voice. "Then perhaps God has finally sent help to Ravenswood Hall." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You believe your master was murdered?" The butler hesitated. "I believe, sir, that evil walks this house." Blackthorn gave an exasperated movement. Enough of that nonsense. Yet even he glanced uneasily toward the darkened upper windows as we entered the hall. The interior proved no less impressive than the exterior. A vast ancestral chamber stretched before us, dimly illuminated by oil lamps, whose glow barely penetrated the heavy shadows clinging to the carved oak walls. Portraits of long dead Blackthorns stared down from tarnished frames, their severe faces lending the place an oppressive atmosphere of judgment. The wind moaned faintly somewhere in the upper reaches of the house. Holmes removed his gloves slowly, his eyes moving ceaselessly over every detail. Then his attention fixed suddenly upon the stone floor near the staircase. Without a word he bent down. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes touched the flagstones lightly with one finger. "Interesting." Blackthorn approached nervously. "You see something?" Holmes rose. "A stain," said he calmly. "Blood?" "No." His eyes drifted upward toward the dark galleries overhead. "Candle grease." Chapter 3. The Gallery of Whispering Wings dinner at Ravenswood Hall was among the grimmest meals I have ever endured. The great dining chamber, though magnificent in proportion, possessed so mournful an atmosphere that even the warmth of the fire seemed unable to dispel it. Massive oak beams crossed the ceiling like the ribs of some ancient beast, while portraits of dead Blackthorns lined the walls in endless succession. Their painted eyes appeared to follow one's movements with cold disapproval. The storm outside had strengthened steadily since our arrival. Rain lashed against the tall mullioned windows, and from time to time the wind descended the chimneys with a low mournful cry that resembled distant voices. Only 4 persons sat at table. Edmund Blackthorne occupied the head with evident discomfort. Beside him sat a pale young woman, introduced as Miss Clara Whitmore, niece to the late Reginald Blackthorne. Opposite her was a broad-shouldered gentleman of military bearing, named Colonel Julian Forsyth, an old associate of the family. Holmes and I completed the party. The servants moved silently about the room with that peculiar strained attentiveness observable in households, overshadowed by recent tragedy. Holmes, however, appeared entirely unaffected by the oppressive surroundings. He ate sparingly, as was his habit, while directing the conversation with deceptive casualness. "You resided here during your uncle's death, Miss Whitmore." The young lady lowered her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Holmes." She could not have exceeded 25 years of age, and possessed a delicate beauty heightened rather than diminished by grief. There was intelligence in her expression, yet also unmistakable anxiety. More than once during dinner, I observed her glance nervously toward the darkened corners of the chamber. "And you discovered nothing unusual that evening?" "No," Colonel Forsyth snorted quietly into his wine. "The whole damned house was unusual." Blackthorne frowned. "Julian." "No." "Let us speak plainly," said the Colonel bluntly. "Half the servants are ready to flee. The villagers whisper like frightened children. Every corridor in this place creaks like a coffin lid." Holmes looked mildly interested. "You yourself are not susceptible to superstition, Colonel?" "I spent 20 years in Afghanistan and Burma," returned the soldier dryly. "I have seen too much real death to fear nursery tales." "Yet," Forsyth hesitated, "yet there is something wrong at Ravenswood." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "What precisely?" Before the Colonel could answer, Miss Whitmore spoke suddenly. "The sounds." The room fell still. Holmes turned toward her. "What sounds?" She clasped her hands tightly together. "At night one hears movement in the west gallery." Blackthorne gave an impatient gesture. "Old houses make noises." "Not like these," she whispered. Holmes leaned back slightly. "You have heard them personally?" "Yes." "What kind of movement?" The girl seemed reluctant to answer. "Sometimes footsteps, sometimes other things." Holmes waited. "At moments," she said at last, barely audibly. "It sounds as though something large is moving above the ceiling." "A bird," Holmes suggested quietly. Miss Whitmore looked up sharply. "Yes." Blackthorne pushed away his wineglass with sudden irritation. "This is absurd. We invited Mr. Holmes here to investigate Reginald's death, not indulge ghost stories." Holmes' expression remained perfectly composed. "On the contrary, Mr. Blackthorne, ghost stories are often extremely instructive. They reveal what people fear, and occasionally what they wish others to fear." Forsyth gave a short laugh. "Spoken like a rationalist. Spoken like a logician." The Colonel studied Holmes thoughtfully across the table. "And what is your impression thus far?" "That everyone in this house is withholding something." An awkward silence followed this remark. Even Blackthorne appeared momentarily disconcerted. Holmes calmly resumed buttering a piece of bread. "Which is perfectly natural," he continued. "Families rarely expose themselves honestly before strangers." After dinner, Holmes requested an immediate inspection of the West Gallery. I confess I was not sorry when we at last rose from the table, for the atmosphere within that chamber had become nearly unbearable. The combination of storm, silence and suppressed anxiety weighed heavily upon every occupant. Marcham, the butler, led us upstairs, carrying a heavy candelabrum, whose wavering light cast grotesque shadows along the walls. The corridors of Ravenswood Hall formed a bewildering labyrinth of passages, staircases, and intersecting galleries accumulated across centuries of additions to the original structure. Several portions appeared scarcely inhabited at all. Dust coated the edges of carved furniture, and faded tapestries stirred faintly in the draughts, creeping through unseen cracks. "This wing is among the oldest parts of the hall," said Blackthorne, as we climbed a narrow staircase. "The West Gallery dates to the reign of James I." Holmes ran long fingers lightly along the panelled wall. "Excellent construction," said he absently, though altered repeatedly. You can tell that. My dear Watson could tell it. I could do nothing of the kind, said I. Holmes smiled faintly. The grain changes here, different oak. Observe also the irregular spacing between the sconces. We emerged at last into a long corridor so dim and ancient that it seemed almost untouched by modern life. This is the West Gallery, whispered Miss Whitmore. The place possessed a singularly oppressive character, the ceiling arched low overhead, supported by blackened beams, from which age-old dust hung like cobwebbed lace. Tall, narrow windows overlooked storm-swept moors beyond, though the rain upon the glass rendered the outside world indistinct and ghostly. Portraits lined both walls, not the formal aristocratic paintings displayed below, but older works executed in darker tones. Stern blackthorns in armour, lace collars, or sombre velvet stared from the shadows with expressions varying from pride to cruelty. At the far end stood a heavy oaken door. "My brother was found there," said Blackthorn quietly. Holmes took the candelabrum from Marcham and advanced slowly down the gallery. The flames trembled in the stale air. No one spoke. I observed Holmes examining every detail with extraordinary intensity. The floorboards, wall panelling, ceiling beams, even the ancient portraits themselves. At intervals he knelt briefly to inspect the dust upon the floor. At length he halted before the door. "This leads where?" "To the old tower chamber." "You entered after the body was discovered?" "Yes, and nothing has been altered since." "Very little." Holmes opened the door. The chamber beyond proved circular in shape and sparsely furnished. A narrow bed stood against one wall beside a small writing desk. Opposite rose an enormous fireplace blackened by age. It was immediately apparent that this room had once served some defensive purpose in earlier centuries, for the walls measured several feet thick, and the windows were little more than arrow slits, widened slightly by later occupants. Holmes raised the candles higher. "Where was the body found?" Blackthorn pointed toward the hearth. "There." Holmes crossed silently to the spot. For several moments he remained motionless, gazing downward. Then he crouched suddenly. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. Instead of replying, Holmes produced his lens. The rest of us watched in silence while he conducted an extraordinarily mute minute examination of the stone floor. His thin features assumed that expression of absorbed concentration which always fascinated me. At length he rose. The blood mark was Ware's. Blackthorn moved toward the wall above the fireplace. "There." Holmes studied the stonework carefully. Though cleaned, a faint discoloration remained visible upon the ancient surface. "You removed it quickly," said Holmes. "The servants were terrified. Quite understandable." He stepped backward several paces, eyes half closed. "A curious stage," he murmured. "Stage?" repeated Forsyth. Holmes gestured lightly about the chamber. "Consider the arrangement. The dead man positioned beside the hearth, the symbol above him, locked windows, ancient tower room, every detail calculated for dramatic effect. You think someone arranged the scene deliberately?" "My dear Colonel," said Holmes, "people very seldom arrange supernatural manifestations accidentally." Miss Whitmore shivered visibly. "You speak so calmly of dreadful things." Holmes turned toward her with surprising gentleness, because calmness is useful where fear is not. At that instant a sudden sound broke the silence overhead. A heavy scraping noise. Every person in the chamber started. The sound came again, slow, dragging, unmistakably above us. Miss Whitmore uttered a low cry. Blackthorn's face drained of colour. Forsyth swore under his breath. Only Holmes remained unmoved. "Interesting," said he quietly. The noise continued briefly, followed by 3 distinct thuds. Then silence, no one moved. Holmes raised the candelabrum higher and examined the ceiling thoughtfully. "A concealed chamber above?" he asked. Blackthorn swallowed. "There is an old storage loft. How accessed?" "A stair beyond the eastern corridor." Holmes handed me the candles abruptly. "Come, Watson." Without waiting for the others, he strode from the tower chamber with astonishing speed. I hurried after him while the remaining occupants followed in evident alarm. The gallery seemed darker than before. Our footsteps echoed sharply along the boards as Holmes moved rapidly toward the eastern end. Several times he paused momentarily, orienting himself with swift glances. "This way," said Blackthorne breathlessly, pointing toward a narrow side passage. A steep staircase rose into darkness. Holmes ascended instantly, taking the steps 2 at a time. I followed close behind, revolver instinctively in hand. The air grew colder as we climbed. At the top we found ourselves before a small wooden door hanging partially open. Holmes stopped dead. Then, with sudden caution, he motioned us back. "What is it?" I whispered. Instead of answering, he bent and touched the floorboards lightly. When he straightened again, his eyes glittered strangely. "Someone was here moments ago." Blackthorne stared. "How can you know that?" Holmes pointed silently downward. Upon the dusty floor of the loft, plainly visible in the candlelight, stretched a trail of fresh footprints. They crossed the room directly toward the far wall, and there they ended completely. The wall itself was solid oak, no window, no second door, nothing. Miss Whitmore gave a faint gasp behind us. Dear God. Even I felt an involuntary tightening of the nerves. The footprints simply ceased, as though whoever made them had vanished into the wood itself. Holmes alone appeared neither astonished nor alarmed. On the contrary, a curious expression of satisfaction crossed his face. "My compliments," said he, softly into the silence. "Very ingenious indeed." Chapter 4. The Man Who Vanished Through Oak. For several moments no one spoke. The candle flames flickered uncertainly in the cold loft, illuminating the footprints which advanced clearly through the dust and terminated with impossible abruptness against the oak-panelled wall. The effect was profoundly disquieting. Even Colonel Forsyth, whose military bluntness had thus far resisted the superstitious atmosphere of Ravenswood Hall, stared with visible unease. "This is devilry," muttered Blackthorne hoarsely. Holmes gave an impatient click of the tongue. "On the contrary, it is carpentry." He thrust the candelabrum into my hands and dropped to one knee before the wall. His fingers travelled rapidly over the ancient panels, tapping lightly here and there with the tips of his long, nervous fingers. "You see something?" I asked. "I hear something." He struck one section sharply. A dull note answered, another. Then suddenly a hollow resonance sounded beneath the wood. Holmes smiled. "Precisely." Blackthorne stepped forward in astonishment. "A concealed passage? Almost certainly." Forsyth crossed his arms. "Then where is the opening?" "That," said Holmes, "is the interesting question." He examined the wall minutely, moving with extraordinary patience from panel to panel. Several minutes passed in complete silence, save for the distant groaning of the storm outside. At length Holmes paused before a carved section depicting intertwined branches and birds. "Ah." He pressed firmly upon the carved head of one of the birds. Instantly a concealed latch clicked somewhere within the wall. Miss Whitmore uttered a cry as an entire section of panelling swung slowly inward. Beyond lay darkness. A narrow stone passage extended into the depths of the house. Blackthorne recoiled visibly. "I never knew." "Which suggests the passage predates your occupancy," said Holmes calmly. He took back the candelabrum and raised it toward the opening. The narrow corridor beyond descended steeply into blackness, thick with stale air and dust. Forsyth frowned. "These old houses often contain priest-holes and smuggling routes." "Yes," said Holmes absently, "though this one appears to have seen recent use." He indicated the stone floor. Unlike the loft outside, the passage dust had been disturbed repeatedly. Fresh tracks crossed and recrossed the narrow stair. Holmes' eyes brightened. "Excellent." Before anyone could protest, he stepped into the hidden corridor. I followed immediately. "Really, Holmes," said I in a low voice, "this may be dangerous." "My dear Watson," he murmured, "that is what makes life tolerable." The passage twisted sharply downward through the thickness of the ancient walls. The air smelled of damp stone and age-old timber. More than once I was obliged to duck beneath low beams blackened by centuries. Behind us came the hesitant footsteps of Blackthorne and the others. Holmes advanced silently, holding the candles high. "Observe," said he quietly. The stone steps bore unmistakable marks. Mud. Fresh. "A man passed this way recently," said I. "Within the hour. You can determine that. The moisture remains visible despite the dry interior. Elementary." We continued downward for perhaps 50 yards before the passage divided. Holmes halted instantly. "One branch toward the eastern wing," he said softly, the other descending further. Forsyth glanced uneasily into the gloom. "This place is a maze." Holmes crouched near the fork. "Interesting." "What now?" asked Blackthorne. "The tracks separate." Indeed they did. One set of footprints, larger and heavily impressed, continued downward into darkness. Another, narrower and lighter, turned eastward. Holmes studied them intently. "A man and a woman," said he. Miss Whitmore stared. "A woman. The smaller impressions possess a narrower heel and shorter stride, unless Ravenswood employs remarkably delicate footmen." Blackthorne looked genuinely shocked. "This is impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Holmes replied, "merely improbable." He straightened abruptly. "Colonel Forsyth, you and Mr. Blackthorne will examine the eastern branch. Watson and I shall continue downward." "I object strongly," said I, "naturally. This house may conceal armed criminals." "An additional reason for bringing your revolver." Before I could argue further, Holmes had already begun descending the lower passage. There was no alternative but to accompany him. The corridor narrowed steadily as we advanced. In several places ancient brickwork had crumbled partially inward, forcing us sideways through constricted gaps. At length the passage opened suddenly into a subterranean chamber. I halted in astonishment. The room appeared enormous. Its vaulted stone ceiling vanished into shadows beyond the reach of our candles. Rows of ancient wine racks lined one wall, though most stood empty or collapsed with age. Broken crates, rusted chains, and fragments of mouldering furniture lay scattered across the floor. Yet it was not these things which immediately seized Holmes's attention. Near the centre of the chamber stood a table, and upon it rested a lantern still faintly warm. Holmes crossed rapidly toward it. "Recently extinguished," said he. "You believe someone heard us coming?" "Undoubtedly." He examined the table surface carefully. "A meal." I looked closer. Several crumbs of bread remained beside an empty bottle. "He has been hiding here." "Perhaps." Holmes lifted the bottle toward the candlelight. Then suddenly his expression sharpened. "What is it?" Instead of answering, he handed me the bottle. Around the neck clung a small scrap of dark cloth. I examined it closely. "Velvet, exactly." Holmes' eyes glittered. "Our invisible resident possesses expensive tastes." A faint sound interrupted us. Footsteps. Both Holmes and I turned instantly. The noise came from somewhere deeper within the subterranean darkness. Soft, retreating rapidly. Holmes moved like lightning. After him. He seized the lantern, relit it with astonishing speed, and darted across the chamber toward a low archway partly concealed behind fallen crates. I rushed after him. The passage beyond twisted violently through utter darkness. Several times I caught glimpses of movement ahead. A fleeting shadow illuminated momentarily by Holmes' swinging lantern. "Stop!" I shouted. No answer came. Then suddenly a door slammed somewhere ahead with tremendous force. Holmes increased speed. We burst at last into another chamber, only to find it empty, utterly empty. A single door stood half open opposite us, swaying slowly upon its hinges. Beyond it stretched open night. Rain lashed inward from the storm outside. We had emerged upon the moor itself. Holmes sprang through the doorway. I followed immediately into wind and darkness. The storm struck like a physical blow. Rain drove across the heath in blinding sheets, while the moorland beyond dissolved into shifting blackness. Holmes held the lantern high. "There!" For an instant I glimpsed a figure running across the moor, perhaps 50 yards distant. Tall, wrapped in a dark cloak, then lightning split the sky. In that terrible white flash the fugitive turned partially toward us. I saw only fragments clearly, a pale face, dark eyes, and something else. A mark or scar running across one cheek, then darkness swallowed the figure again. Holmes uttered an exclamation, unlike any sound I had previously heard from him, a mixture of astonishment and fierce excitement. What is it?" He did not answer. Instead, he began pursuing the figure across the rain-soaked heath with reckless determination. I struggled after him, slipping repeatedly upon the sodden ground. The fugitive moved with extraordinary speed despite the storm. Twice more lightning illuminated him briefly ahead. Then he vanished entirely into the darkness. Holmes stopped abruptly beside a cluster of jagged stones protruding from the moor. For several seconds he stood motionless, listening. Only the wind answered. At last he lowered the lantern slowly. "Gone." I drew breath heavily. "Did you recognize him?" Holmes remained silent. Rain streamed from his coat and hat, yet he seemed scarcely aware of it. "Holmes!" At length he spoke in a strangely altered tone. "No. You saw something?" "Yes." "What?" He turned toward Ravenswood Hall, looming dimly through the storm. "What I saw," said he quietly, "makes this case considerably more dangerous than I anticipated." Before I could press him further, another sound reached us across the moor. A scream. A woman's scream. It came unmistakably from the direction of the hall. Holmes wheeled instantly. "Quick, Watson!" We ran. The great manor rose before us black against the storm clouds several. Windows now brightly illuminated. Figures moved frantically within. As we reached the concealed doorway through which we had emerged, Colonel Forsyth appeared from the darkness carrying a lamp. His face was pale beneath the rain. "Thank God," he cried. "Something's happened." "What?" "It's Miss Whitmore." Holmes seized him by the arm. "Speak plainly." Forsyth swallowed. "We found her unconscious in the gallery. And?" The Colonel hesitated. "She was lying beneath another raven mark." Chapter V. The second raven, the confusion which greeted our return to Ravenswood Hall bordered upon panic. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying lamps and whispering fearfully among themselves. Doors stood open throughout the western wing, while somewhere in the distance a woman sobbed uncontrollably. The oppressive silence which had earlier dominated the house had now given way to nervous agitation, as though the ancient manor itself had awakened into dread. Holmes moved through the disorder with swift, cold efficiency. "Where is Miss Whitmore?" "In her room," said Forsyth. "Dr. Felton has been sent for." "Excellent. Has she regained consciousness?" "Briefly." "And the mark?" The Colonel's expression darkened. "Still there." Holmes wasted no further words. We followed him rapidly through the maze-like passages until we reached a spacious chamber overlooking the eastern lawns. Miss Clara Whitmore lay upon a sofa near the fire, pale as ivory beneath the flickering lamplight. A maid knelt beside her with smellings and salts, while Marcham the butler hovered anxiously nearby. At our entrance the girl stirred faintly. Holmes approached at once. "You are safe, Miss Whitmore." Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment she seemed not to recognize us. Then memory returned with dreadful force, and she clutched convulsively at Holmes' sleeve. "The raven," she whispered. Holmes' voice remained calm and steady. "You saw someone?" Her breathing quickened. No, I heard it first." "What did you hear?" "Wings." Blackthorne uttered an impatient sound from behind us, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. "Describe precisely what occurred." Miss Whitmore closed her eyes briefly, as though mastering herself. "I had retired early. I could not sleep because of the storm. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard movement in the west gallery." "Footsteps?" "No." Her voice trembled, scratching, like claws against wood. Holmes listened intently. "I thought perhaps one of the servants remained awake, so I opened my door." The corridor was empty. "And then?" "I saw something upon the wall." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "The symbol?" She nodded weakly. It had not been there before. "Freshly drawn?" "Yes. What did you do?" "I became frightened and turned to return to my room." She swallowed hard. Then I heard the wings. A silence fell over the chamber. "From where?" Holmes asked quietly. "Above me." Even now, recounting the event, the girl's terror appeared genuine enough to affect every listener present. "I looked upward," she whispered. "Something moved across the gallery ceiling." "You saw it clearly?" "No. Only a shadow." Her fingers tightened convulsively upon the blanket. "Then I remember nothing more." Holmes remained thoughtful for several moments. "At what point was Miss Whitmore discovered?" he asked. Marcham stepped forward. I found her, sir, near 12:30. In the gallery itself? Yes, Mr. Holmes, and the mark. The old butler crossed himself unconsciously. Above her head. Holmes rose immediately. Take me there. The west gallery appeared even more sinister by night. The storm beyond the windows had intensified into full violence. Rain hammered against the ancient panes, while intermittent lightning transformed the corridor into a succession of ghastly illuminated tableaux. Near the centre of the gallery, upon the oak-panelled wall between two portraits, I saw the symbol, a raven. Its wings spread wide, crudely painted in what was unmistakably blood. The thing possessed a grotesque vitality in the shifting candlelight. Blackthorne turned away with a muttered curse. Exactly the same as before, said Forsyth quietly. Holmes stood motionless before the mark. Then he surprised us all by leaning forward and sniffing it. Holmes, I exclaimed. Yes, Watson. You cannot seriously. It is blood, said he calmly. Human blood, unless I am mistaken. He examined the floor next. No sign of struggle. Miss Whitmore simply collapsed, said Marcham nervously. Apparently. Holmes' gaze drifted slowly upward toward the dark beams overhead. Then suddenly he stepped onto a narrow bench beneath the portraits and raised the candle closer to the ceiling. Aha! What now? Asked Blackthorne. Holmes pointed. Several faint scratches marked the timber above, fresh scratches, as though made by sharp metal hooks or claws. Forsyth frowned. What in heaven's name made those? Holmes stepped down without answering. Instead he crossed slowly toward the nearest window. Rain streamed against the glass in torrents. After a brief inspection he nodded to himself. Opened recently. Blackthorne stared. That window has been locked for months. Nevertheless, it was opened tonight. You are certain? Holmes held up one finger. A thin smear of dark mud clung to it. The sill bears fresh traces from outside. Forsyth moved quickly beside him. But the drop below is nearly 30 feet. 28, said Holmes absently. You suggest someone climbed to the gallery window during a storm? I suggest nothing, I observe. He turned abruptly toward Marcham. How many servants remain in the hall? 12, sir, and all accounted for. The butler hesitated. No, sir. Holmes' eyes sharpened instantly. Who is absent? One of the maids. Sarah. When was she last seen? Before supper. Blackthorne stared. Why was I not informed? Marcham looked miserable. She has a sweetheart in Grimshaw village, sir. We thought, perhaps. Holmes interrupted sharply. Search the entire house immediately. Within moments the hall erupted once more into movement. Servants carrying lamps dispersed through corridors and stairways, while Holmes returned silently to examining the gallery. I watched him closely. There was about him now an intensity bordering almost upon excitement. You have formed a theory, said I quietly. Several. And the fugitive upon the moor? Holmes glanced toward me. That individual complicates matters enormously. You recognized him. Holmes was silent a moment too long. At present, said he carefully, I prefer observation to conclusions, which, in Holmesian language, meant precisely the reverse. A cry suddenly echoed from somewhere below. Then hurried footsteps. Marcham reappeared, pale and visibly shaken. Mr. Holmes, well, we found her. Where? The butler swallowed. In the old chapel. Blackthorne gave a startled exclamation. There is no chapel in use. Not for 40 years, sir. Holmes seized a lamp. Take us there at once. The abandoned chapel lay in the oldest portion of Ravenswood Hall, beyond a series of neglected corridors, seldom entered by the household. The air grew colder as we descended narrow stone steps, lit only by our lamps. Dust coated everything heavily here, and several doorways had been boarded shut altogether. At last Marcham stopped before a warped wooden door hanging partly ajar. She is inside. Holmes entered immediately. The chamber beyond had once clearly served as a private family chapel, though time and neglect had transformed it into something bleak and mournful. Broken pews stood beneath crumbling arches. Torn remnants of religious banners hung mouldering from the walls. At the far end rose a stone altar thick with dust, and before it lay the missing maid. Sarah was alive, though barely conscious. The girl had collapsed against the altar steps, her face deathly pale and clothing soaked through with rainwater. One arm bore a deep cut, from which blood still oozed sluggishly. Watson the physician overcame Watson the observer at once. I knelt beside her while Holmes examined the surroundings. "She has lost considerable blood," said I, "but not fatally." "What caused the wound?" asked Forsyth. I inspected the injury. "A narrow blade, perhaps, or sharp metal." Holmes turned instantly. "Hooks, possibly." At that word Sarah stirred faintly. Her eyes fluttered open in terror. "No," she gasped. "Keep it away." "You are safe," said I firmly. The girl's gaze darted wildly about the ruined chapel before fixing suddenly upon Holmes. "The raven," she whispered. Holmes knelt beside her. "What raven?" "It came through the gallery." "Who came?" Sarah began trembling violently. "I didn't mean to spy. I swear it." Holmes' voice became extraordinarily gentle. "What did you see?" The maid stared at him with feverish eyes. "A man." Blackthorne stepped forward sharply. "What man?" But Sarah seemed scarcely aware of us now. "He wore black," she whispered. "And the bird." Holmes leaned closer. "What bird?" "The great black bird upon his shoulder." A silence followed so profound that I could hear only the storm and the girl's ragged breathing. Holmes's face had become utterly expressionless. "What happened then?" Sarah's lips trembled. "He saw me watching." "And," he said, "the raven judges the guilty." The girl gave a sudden cry of terror and clutched Holmes' arm with surprising strength. "Don't let him come back." Then she fainted entirely. For several moments no one spoke. At last Forsyth muttered uneasily, "This grows damned strange." Holmes rose slowly. "No," said he, in a very quiet voice. "It grows clearer." Chapter Vic. Holmes reads the ashes. The remainder of that night passed in restless confusion, Doctor. Felton arrived shortly after 2 o'clock, and confirmed my own opinion that Sarah's wound, though severe, was not life-threatening. The poor girl remained in a state of extreme nervous collapse, however, and could provide no further coherent account of what she had witnessed. Holmes appeared singularly dissatisfied by this. "She knows more than she dares reveal," he remarked as we retired temporarily to a small smoking room overlooking the inner courtyard. The storm had finally begun to abate, though rain still drifted intermittently against the windows. Somewhere in the ancient house, a clock struck 3 with a hollow, sepulchral resonance. I confess my nerves had come considerably strained. The oppressive architecture of Ravenswood Hall, the repeated appearances of the blood mark, the mysterious fugitive upon the moor, and now the maid's extraordinary story concerning a man accompanied by a raven, all combined to produce an atmosphere unlike any case I had previously shared with Holmes. My companion, however, seemed invigorated rather than disturbed. He had appropriated the smoking room entirely for his investigations. Papers, candle stubs, muddy fragments, scraped from window sills, and several curious objects collected during the evening now littered the table before him. Among these lay the small piece of velvet cloth recovered from the underground chamber. Holmes examined it once more beneath the lamp. "Expensive material," said he softly, "tailored rather than purchased ready-made. You think it belonged to the man we pursued?" "Almost certainly." "Then why conceal himself beneath Ravenswood Hall?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, that is precisely the correct question. One should always treasure the correct question." He reached for a small envelope containing greyish powder, gathered earlier from the gallery wall. "And this," he continued, "is equally instructive." "What is it?" "Not what one would expect." He sprinkled a small quantity upon white paper and examined it through his lens. "Interesting." "Well?" "The supposed blood mark upon the gallery wall contained traces of fireplace ash." I stared. "Ash, yes. But surely, human blood mixed deliberately with soot." Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes glittering, which transforms symbolism into craftsmanship. I lit my pipe thoughtfully. "You imply the raven marks are manufactured with care, rather than spontaneous threats." "Exactly. And the purpose? To create terror." He spoke the last words with sudden sharpness. "Observe the sequence. A family already burdened by generations of morbid legend. A dramatic death. Blood symbols, nocturnal sounds, Secret passages, vanishing figures, every element designed to cultivate supernatural fear. Yet Reginald Blackthorne truly died. Yes, Holmes steepled his fingers. The central question is whether his death resulted from fright, or whether fright merely concealed something else. I considered this carefully. You suspect murder despite the physician's verdict. Holmes gave a short laugh. My dear fellow, provincial physicians diagnose heart failure with remarkable enthusiasm whenever confronted by anything inconvenient. At that moment, a soft knock interrupted us. Enter. The door opened cautiously and Miss Whitmore stepped inside. She had changed from the evening gown in which she had collapsed, and now wore a dark travelling robe hastily thrown over her shoulders. Though pale and visibly exhausted, she had recovered sufficient composure to speak steadily. I hope I do not intrude. Not at all, said Holmes, rising instantly. Pray sit down. She remained standing. I wish to speak privately. Holmes glanced toward me. Dr. Watson is entirely trustworthy. I know, said she quietly. There was something in her manner which immediately caught Holmes' full attention. You are afraid, said he. Yes. Of the Raven? No. The answer came so quickly and firmly that even Holmes' eyebrows rose slightly. Then of whom? Miss Whitmore hesitated. I cannot say. Holmes' voice grew very gentle. Miss Whitmore, unless you speak honestly, I cannot protect you. She lowered her gaze. It is not myself I fear for. Holmes remained silent. At last she drew a folded paper from within her sleeve. I found this beneath my bedroom door an hour ago. Holmes took it swiftly. The paper contained only a single sentence, written in hurried black ink. The Raven sees those who betray the dead. Holmes studied it intently. No signature. No. When did this arrive? After the servants carried me upstairs. Holmes handed the note to me. The handwriting appeared disguised, though uneven in a manner suggesting haste or agitation. You have shown this to no one else? No. Excellent. Holmes crossed toward the fire, holding the note near the light without burning it. What do you conclude? I asked. That the author is educated. From so little. My dear Watson, illiterate persons seldom attempt disguise. Miss Whitmore clasped her hands tightly together. Mr. Holmes, there is something else. Yes, she glanced nervously toward the door before continuing. Uncle Reginald had become terrified during the last weeks before his death. In what manner? He claimed someone moved about the hall at night. Holmes nodded slightly. The hidden passages? Yes, but he believed more than that. What precisely? The young woman's voice dropped almost to a whisper. He believed someone long thought dead had returned to Ravenswood. Holmes became utterly still. Who? His younger brother. Blackthorne's name had scarcely left her lips when the door burst violently open. Edmund Blackthorne himself stood there, breathing hard, his face flushed with anger. Clara, the girl started visibly. I warned you not to discuss family matters. Holmes' eyes narrowed. An unfortunate interruption, Mr. Blackthorne. The man seemed immediately conscious of having lost self-control. My apologies, he muttered. Marcham informed me Miss Whitmore had left her room. She came voluntarily. Blackthorne's gaze shifted uneasily toward the paper in Holmes's hand. What is that? A note received recently by Miss Whitmore. He crossed the room sharply. Let me see it. Holmes folded the paper calmly and slipped it into his pocket. Later, perhaps. For a moment I thought Blackthorne might actually seize him. Instead he mastered himself with visible effort. You must understand, said he stiffly. The women in this house are overwrought. Holmes studied him thoughtfully. Indeed, particularly regarding your brother. A shadow crossed Blackthorne's face. Reginald was not an easy man, so I gather. Holmes paused. Miss Whitmore informs me your late brother feared someone from the family past. Blackthorne's expression hardened instantly. Old nonsense. Concerning whom? My youngest brother Adrian. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. Ah. Blackthorne moved toward the fireplace. He vanished nearly 15 years ago. Vanished? After quarrelling violently with Reginald, he left Ravenswood and was never seen again. No body recovered? Nah. Holmes' eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. How convenient, Blackthorne stared. You think Adrian alive? I think nothing yet. Miss Whitmore spoke quietly from beside the door. Uncle Reginald believed he had returned. Nonsense, snapped Blackthorne. Did your brother receive threats? Holmes asked. No's. Letters. No. Citing. Blackthorne hesitated. Once. The word hung heavily in the room. Holmes said nothing. 3 nights before his death. Blackthorne continued reluctantly. Reginald claimed he saw Adrian standing upon the western lawn. And did you? No. Describe Adrian Blackthorne. The man passed, a hand across his brow. He was 10 years younger than Reginald, clever, charismatic, reckless. And the quarrel? A family matter. Holmes smiled very slightly. My dear sir, every murder investigation eventually becomes a family matter. Blackthorne's jaw tightened. Adrian wished to sell portions of the estate. Reginald refused. They fought bitterly. And afterward, Adrian disappeared forever. Yes. Without collecting money? Blackthorne hesitated again. No. Holmes' eyes flashed briefly. Interesting. At that instant, a sudden noise echoed faintly through the hall, a door slamming somewhere distant. Then footsteps, rapid footsteps running overhead. All 3 of us looked upward instinctively. Blackthorne swore softly. Holmes was already moving. Come, Watson. We rushed from the room into the corridor beyond. The footsteps continued somewhere above us. Running, heavy, then abruptly stopping. Servants emerged anxiously from nearby chambers as Holmes raced toward the main staircase with astonishing speed. Which direction? He snapped. Marcham pointed upward with trembling hand. The tower stairs, sir. Holmes bounded upward 3 steps at a time. I followed close behind, revolver drawn once more. The tower corridor above lay dark and silent when we reached it. No movement, no sound. Only the wavering glow of our lamps against ancient stone. Holmes halted suddenly near the entrance to the west gallery. Something lay upon the floorboards ahead, a bird. Black feathers spread grotesquely across the wood, dead. I bent beside it. A raven, said I quietly. Its neck had been twisted with savage force. Around one leg was tied a narrow strip of paper. Holmes untied it carefully and unfolded the message within. Only 4 words appeared. Ask the dead brother. For the first time since our arrival at Ravenswood Hall, I saw genuine astonishment break through Holmes's composure. Very slowly he turned toward the darkened gallery. Watson, said he softly, our adversary has begun answering questions before I ask them. And in the shadows beyond us, somewhere deep within the ancient house, there came once more the sound of wings. Chapter 7. The portrait in the sealed room. I have often remarked that Sherlock Holmes possessed 2 distinct temperaments. There were occasions when his mind moved with such cold precision that he resembled a calculating machine rather than a human being. At other times, particularly when confronted by an adversary of unusual subtlety, he exhibited a fierce intellectual excitement, bordering almost upon recklessness. The discovery of the dead raven affected him in precisely this latter fashion. Far from discouraging him, the incident appeared to sharpen every faculty he possessed. He carried the bird himself back to the smoking room, where he proceeded to examine it with minute attention, while I watched in growing bewilderment. A healthy specimen, said he at last, recently captured. You can determine that? The claws show no damage from confinement, and the feathers are remarkably clean. Someone obtained this creature deliberately for tonight's performance. Blackthorne, who had followed us in visible agitation, stared uneasily at the carcass upon the table. This is becoming intolerable. Holmes looked up sharply. Intolerable, because you are frightened, or because someone else knows too much? The question struck like a pistol shot. Blackthorne flushed darkly. What do you mean by that? I mean, said Holmes coolly, that anonymous warnings seldom emerge from nowhere. Whoever orchestrates these events possesses intimate knowledge of Ravenswood Hall and its inhabitants. Forsyth crossed heavily to the fireplace. Then arrest the fellow and be done with it. My dear Colonel, I have not yet identified him. You suspect the vanished brother. Holmes' eyes drifted toward the raven. I suspect the past. which was precisely the sort of answer that drove practical men like myself to distraction. At length, Holmes rose abruptly. "I should like to examine Adrian Blackthorne's rooms." Blackthorne stared. "They have remained locked for years." "All the better. I see no relevance." "You rarely do," said Holmes pleasantly, despite obvious reluctance. Our host produced a heavy ring of keys and led us once more through the labyrinthine upper corridors of the hall. The wing containing Adrian Blackthorne's former chambers appeared almost entirely abandoned. Dust lay thick upon the carpets, and several oil lamps had long since burned empty. The air smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten things. At the end of a narrow passage, Blackthorne stopped before a dark oak door. My brother occupied these rooms before he vanished. Holmes extended his hand. The key. Blackthorne hesitated only an instant before surrendering it. The lock resisted stubbornly at first, then yielded with a harsh metallic groan. As the door swung inward, stale air drifted out, carrying the unmistakable scent of long confinement. Holmes entered immediately. The room beyond proved surprisingly elegant. Unlike the severe masculine austerity characterizing much of Ravenswood Hall, Adrian Blackthorne's chamber revealed traces of refinement and artistic taste. Though dust-covered now, the furnishings remained handsome. Books lined the shelves in abundance. Several landscapes leaned unfinished against one wall beside easels and painting materials. "A painter?" I asked. "Among other things," said Blackthorne stiffly. Holmes moved silently through the chamber. "Interesting collection." He examined the bookshelves rapidly. French poetry, classical histories, scientific journals. Then suddenly he paused. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. Holmes withdrew a volume from the shelf. "Darwin." Blackthorne looked puzzled. "That proves nothing." "No," said Holmes softly, "but it suggests curiosity rather than superstition." He crossed next toward the writing desk near the window. The drawers had evidently been emptied long ago. Yet Holmes continued examining them with stubborn thoroughness. "You expect to find hidden correspondence after 15 years, said Forsyth sceptically. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Colonel, people conceal truths far more successfully than objects." He knelt suddenly beside the desk. "Aha. What now?" Holmes pointed toward the floorboards beneath. A faint scrap marked the wood. Then another. Using his penknife, Holmes pressed carefully against the edge of one narrow board. It lifted immediately. Beneath lay a concealed compartment. Blackthorne uttered a startled oath. Inside the cavity rested a small leather portfolio wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes opened it carefully upon the desk. The contents consisted chiefly of letters, sketches, and several folded documents yellowed with age. Holmes examined them swiftly. Then his expression changed. "Well?" said I. Without answering, he handed me one of the papers. It proved to be a legal document. I scanned it quickly. "Good heavens!" Blackthorne stepped forward sharply. "What is it?" "A codicil to your father's will," said Holmes quietly. The man stared. "That is impossible." "Apparently not." Holmes tapped the document lightly. "According to this, should Reginald Blackthorne die without lawful issue, ownership of certain western lands would pass not to you, but to Adrian Blackthorne." Silence filled the chamber. Forsyth swore under his breath. Blackthorne's face had become corpse-like in its pallor. I never heard of such a thing, perhaps because the document was concealed. Holmes' eyes glittered, an omission of considerable importance. Blackthorne sank heavily into a chair. "This changes everything." "Yes," said Holmes softly. "It does," he continued, examining the portfolio. Several sketches caught his attention. One depicted Ravenswood Hall from the western moor under storm clouds, remarkably similar to those presently surrounding us. Another showed the hidden passages beneath the hall, in surprising detail. Holmes spread these carefully across the desk. Our invisible resident knew the tunnels intimately. "He may have discovered them later," said Blackthorne weakly. "Possible." Holmes lifted the final sheet. It was a portrait. Even through the fading charcoal lines, the resemblance struck instantly. The man depicted possessed sharp dark features, intense eyes, and a narrow scar upon one cheek. I looked up sharply at Holmes. The figure upon the moor. Precisely. Blackthorne rose abruptly. No. Holmes turned calmly toward him. You recognize the scar. My brother had no scar. For the first time, Holmes appeared genuinely interested. Indeed, never. Holmes studied the portrait thoughtfully. Then either the fugitive is not Adrian Blackthorne, or 15 years have altered him considerably. At that instant, the candle flames flickered violently. A cold draught swept through the chamber. Forsyth turned sharply. The window? No, said Holmes. He had gone perfectly still, his eyes fixed upon the far wall. I followed his gaze. One of the portraits hanging beside the fireplace had moved. Only slightly, yet unmistakably. Holmes crossed the room in 3 swift strides. The portrait depicted a severe 17th century Blackthorne dressed in black velvet, with a hunting hawk perched upon one gloved wrist. Holmes grasped the frame firmly and pulled. The entire painting swung outward upon concealed hinges. Behind it lay darkness, another hidden passage. Blackthorne stared in horror. Dear God! Holmes raised the lamp. Narrow stone steps descended sharply beyond the concealed opening. Fresh mud stained the upper stair. He has been here recently, said Holmes. Forsyth looked deeply unsettled now. How many secret ways does this damned house contain? As many as necessary, Holmes replied absently. He bent suddenly near the entrance. Then he smiled. A cigarette ash. I looked closer. A thin grey trace lay upon the stone. You can identify it. Trichinopoly, said Holmes instantly. A strong eastern tobacco rarely smoked in England. He glanced toward Blackthorne. Did your brother Adrian favour such cigarettes? Blackthorne shook his head slowly. No. Did Reginald? No. Forsyth frowned. I smoke cigars exclusively. Holmes' smile deepened faintly. Excellent. He slipped the ash carefully into an envelope. Then, without warning, he stepped directly into the concealed passage. Holmes, I protested, but he was already descending. The stair twisted steeply downward, through solid stone, before opening into a narrow corridor, concealed within the walls themselves. We moved slowly now, the silence broken only by distant wind and the soft echo of our footsteps. Then Holmes stopped so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. What is it? He raised one finger. Somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of voices. 2 people speaking in hushed tones. A man and a woman. The words themselves remained indistinct. Holmes extinguished our lamp instantly. Darkness swallowed us whole. Quiet, he breathed. We advanced slowly toward the voices, guided only by their direction. The passage bent sharply ahead. Light glimmered faintly around the corner. Holmes moved like a hunting cat. Then suddenly the voices ceased. Utter silence. Holmes darted forward. We rounded the corner into a tiny concealed chamber, lit by a single lantern, empty, utterly empty. Yet the lantern still burned warm, and upon the small table beside it rested 2 objects, a woman's silver brooch and a revolver. Chapter 8. Holmes sets the snare. Holmes picked up the revolver first. He handled it with extraordinary care, examining the cylinder beneath the lantern light, while the rest of us crowded uneasily within the cramped hidden chamber. One shot fired recently, said he quietly. Blackthorne stared. You think they were armed? My dear sir, though they were undeniably armed, the question is against whom? He sniffed the barrel lightly. Discharged within the last 12 hours. Forsyth frowned darkly. Then, whoever hides in these passages is prepared for violence. Holmes slipped the revolver into his coat pocket and turned his attention to the silver brooch lying beside the lantern. Miss Whitmore, who had remained behind in her room, was not present to identify it, but the object itself was distinctive. A delicate silver raven with ruby eyes worked into the metal. Holmes held it thoughtfully between finger and thumb. A curious emblem. Blackthorne leaned closer. I have seen that before. Indeed, it belonged to my mother. Holmes' eyes sharpened immediately. And how did it arrive here? Blackthorne spread his hands helplessly. I have no idea. Forsyth gave a low whistle. This grows more tangled every hour. No, said Holmes softly. Merely more personal. He surveyed the hidden chamber rapidly. It was scarcely larger than a prison cell. A narrow cot stood against one wall, beside a crate containing candles, preserved food, and several bottles of water. The air smelled faintly of tobacco smoke and damp stone. "He has occupied this refuge for some time," Holmes murmured. "You remain convinced it is a man?" I asked. Holmes gave me an amused glance. "My dear Watson, the romantic imagination delights in invisible spectres. Unfortunately for literature, real villains generally possess feet, lungs, and eating habits." He bent suddenly beside the cot. "Ah, what now?" Instead of replying, Holmes held up a single black feather caught in the blanket. "A raven feather," said I. "Yes." He examined it carefully. "Fresh." Blackthorne shifted uneasily. Then Sarah spoke truth, partially. Holmes rose abruptly. "Our quarry keeps a bird." "A tame raven," said Forsyth sceptically. "Entirely possible. Ravens are intelligent creatures capable of remarkable training." The Colonel looked unconvinced. "You speak as though the fellow were a stage magician." Holmes smiled thinly. "In a sense he is. He manufactures illusion. He extinguished the lantern. Come, we have learned enough for one night." We returned to the main corridors shortly before dawn. The hall had quieted somewhat, though tension remained palpable among both servants and household members. Holmes retired briefly to our shared chambers, yet showed no sign of intending sleep. Instead, he spent the next 2 hours arranging slips of paper across the table with feverish concentration. I awoke from a brief doze near 7 o'clock to find him fully dressed and standing beside the window overlooking the moor. "You have solved it," said I drowsily. "Not entirely, but nearly." Holmes smiled without turning. "There remain 3 serious difficulties, and those are, first, whether Adrian Blackthorne lives. Second, why Reginald truly died. Third," he paused, "the identity of the woman in the hidden passage." "You believe Miss Whitmore involved?" "I believe," said Holmes carefully, "that Miss Whitmore knows considerably more than she admits." Before I could reply, a violent knocking sounded below. Moments later, hurried footsteps approached our door. Marcham entered pale and breathless. "Mr. Holmes, what is it now?" "The dogs, sir." Holmes turned instantly. "What dogs?" "The hunting dogs. Something has happened in the kennels." Within minutes, we had crossed the rain-soaked courtyard toward a stone outbuilding near the western edge of the estate. The kennel-master stood waiting outside in obvious distress. "It's dreadful, sir." Holmes entered without comment. The scene within was ghastly. 3 enormous hounds cowered trembling against the rear wall, whining softly in terror. Another lay dead upon the floor. Its throat had been cut cleanly. Black feathers surrounded the corpse. Forsyth swore violently. "What sort of madman?" Holmes knelt beside the animal. "Interesting." "You find this interesting?" snapped Blackthorne. "Extremely." He pointed toward the dead hound's muzzle. "A curious detail." I bent closer. The animal's jaws were stained darkly around the teeth. "Blood?" "No." Holmes touched it lightly. "Lampblack." He stood abruptly. Our adversary grows impatient. The kennel throt himself. "The dogs went mad during the night, sir, barking and tearing at their chains. Then suddenly one screamed terrible-like." Holmes turned sharply. "At what hour?" "Perhaps 2 in the morning." "During the storm?" "Yes, sir." Holmes stared thoughtfully toward the distant western tower of Ravenswood Hall. Then he spoke in a tone so sudden and decisive that all of us started. "I shall set the trap tonight." Blackthorne blinked. "You know the culprit?" "I know enough." Forsyth folded his arms. "What precisely do you intend?" Holmes' eyes glittered. "To invite the raven into the open." The remainder of the day passed under an atmosphere of growing strain. Holmes moved restlessly throughout the hall and grounds, sometimes disappearing entirely for an hour or more before returning mud-stained and abstracted. Several times I observed him examining architectural features of the western wing with peculiar attention. By afternoon, he requested a private interview with Miss Whitmore. What passed between them I cannot say, though the young lady emerged afterward pale and visibly shaken. Equally curious was Holmes's subsequent conversation with Blackthorne himself. Their voices rose sharply enough at one point to become audible through the study door. "I refuse absolutely," Blackthorne exclaimed. You may refuse reason, Holmes answered coldly, but not necessity. The argument ended only when Holmes emerged looking singularly grim. You have frightened the poor fellow half to death, said I. Excellent. That was deliberate. My dear Watson, frightened men occasionally abandon deception. Toward evening, Holmes finally explained his plan. We gathered in the library shortly after dinner. Holmes, myself, Blackthorne, Forsyth, and Miss Whitmore. Rain drifted once more against the windows, though the storm itself had passed. Holmes stood before the fire, thin and hawk-like in the flickering light. Tonight, said he, the Western Gallery will be left entirely deserted. Blackthorne frowned. And then, Mr. Blackthorne will remain alone in the tower chamber where your brother died. The man stared in alarm. Alone? Entirely. That is madness. On the contrary, it is bait. Miss Whitmore rose suddenly. No, you cannot. Holmes silenced her gently. My dear young lady, danger exists already whether acknowledged or not. Forsyth frowned heavily. You expect the villain to strike again? I expect him to continue the performance. Holmes crossed toward the table. The remainder of us shall conceal ourselves nearby. Every entrance to the gallery will remain under observation. And if nothing occurs? Asked Blackthorne nervously. Holmes smiled very faintly. Something will. He then assigned positions with military precision. Forsyth would watch the eastern stair. I was stationed near the concealed passage behind Adrian Blackthorne's portrait. Holmes himself intended to remain hidden within the tower chamber adjoining Blackthorne's position. You believe the culprit uses the secret corridors? I asked. I know it. And the raven? Holmes' expression became strangely intent. Particularly the raven. By 11 o'clock the trap was prepared. The hall seemed unnaturally silent as we moved into place. Most servants had been dismissed to distant quarters to avoid interference. Only Marcham remained awake below. The west gallery stretched dim and ominous beneath sparse candlelight. At its far end, Blackthorne entered the tower chamber alone. I saw him glance back once toward Holmes with unmistakable dread before closing the heavy oak door behind him. Then silence descended. I concealed myself behind the ancient portrait, concealing the hidden passage, revolver ready in hand. Minutes passed. Then half an hour. The old hall creaked occasionally in the night wind, yet otherwise no sound disturbed the stillness. At length I began wondering whether Holmes's expectations had failed entirely. Then I heard it. Wings. Soft at first, then louder, somewhere above the gallery ceiling, a slow, deliberate beating. I gripped my revolver tighter. The sound moved gradually nearer. Then came another noise, a faint scraping. Directly behind me, I spun instantly. The concealed portrait had moved, only slightly, but enough. A narrow black gap showed between frame and wall, and from the darkness beyond, 2 eyes watched me. Chapter 9. The figure behind the portrait. For one frozen instant, neither I nor the hidden watcher moved. The narrow opening behind the portrait revealed only darkness, and those 2 steady eyes fixed upon me with unnerving intensity. I remember distinctly the peculiar sensation which came over me then. Not fear precisely, but the sharp realization that we stood upon the very brink of the mystery. The beating of wings continued faintly overhead. Then the eyes vanished. The concealed panel began closing silently. I sprang forward at once. Holmes! My cry shattered the silence of the gallery. Instantly chaos erupted. The hidden panel slammed inward. I seized the frame and dragged with all my strength. It resisted for one terrible moment before yielding suddenly beneath my grip. The passage beyond lay dimly illuminated by a shaded lantern, retreating rapidly through the darkness. A figure fled before me. Tall, cloaked in black. Stop! I shouted. No answer came. I plunged into the passage just as another sound exploded through the hall. A scream. Edmund Blackthorne's scream. Then a pistol shot. The narrow corridor became instantly alive with movement. Behind me I heard Holmes burst from concealment like a released spring. This way, Watson. But the fleeing figure ahead had already vanished around a sharp bend. The passage twisted violently downward through the walls. I caught brief glimpses of black fabric disappearing ahead. while somewhere above, the old hall seemed suddenly filled with shouting voices and running feet. Then came another sound, a harsh croaking cry. Not human, the raven. The fugitive darted through a low arch into one of the subterranean chambers beneath Ravenswood Hall. Holmes overtook me there with astonishing speed. "Careful!" he snapped. The lantern light swung wildly across stone walls and ancient wine racks. The chamber appeared empty. Yet Holmes did not hesitate. He crossed directly toward the far wall and struck it sharply with his hand. A concealed door flew inward. After him, cold night air burst against us. The hidden exit opened directly onto the western moor. And there, perhaps 40 yards distant beneath drifting moonlight, the black-cloaked figure raced across the heath. This time we saw him clearly, a large raven wheeled above his shoulder before settling briefly upon his arm. "Good Lord," I breathed. Holmes uttered a fierce exclamation. "He cannot escape now," we pursued at once. The clouds had finally broken apart, allowing pale moonlight to spread across the desolate moorland. Pools of rainwater glimmered among the heather, while the wind swept low across the black earth with mournful force. Ahead of us the fugitive ran toward a jagged ridge of stone, rising beyond the hall grounds. Then suddenly another figure appeared from the darkness. Colonel Forsyth. He emerged directly into the fugitive's path with revolver drawn. "Stop where you are!" The cloaked man halted abruptly. For the first time we saw his face fully. Miss Whitmore had spoken truth. A long scar crossed one cheek from temple to jaw. His features were leaner and harsher than the youthful portrait Holmes had uncovered, yet the resemblance remained unmistakable. Adrian Blackthorne stood before us alive. The raven perched motionless upon his shoulder. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Adrian smiled faintly. "Well played, Mr. Holmes." Holmes approached slowly, breathing hard from the pursuit yet utterly composed. "You might surrender gracefully." "I might," said Adrian quietly, though Ravenswood has seldom rewarded grace. Forsyth kept the revolver steady. "You damned fool. Do you realize the terror you've caused?" Adrian's expression darkened. "Terror," he repeated softly. "You speak to me of terror." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Your brother still lives." The words struck like thunder. Adrian stared. "What? You heard me?" Holmes stepped closer. The shot came from the tower chamber. Yet, had murder been intended, we should already hear alarm from the hall. Adrian's face had gone rigid. "You lie." "No." Holmes's voice remained cold and precise. "You returned to Ravenswood seeking justice, not bloodshed. Had you wished Edmund dead, he would already be buried." The raven shifted restlessly upon Adrian's shoulder. Forsyth frowned. "What in heaven's name is happening?" Holmes kept his eyes fixed upon Adrian. "You discovered Reginald's death before the others. You concealed yourself within the hall afterward, to expose what truly occurred." Adrian's breathing quickened slightly. "And what do you believe occurred?" Holmes answered without hesitation. "Murder." A long silence followed. Wind swept across the moor. At last Adrian spoke in a voice almost inaudible. "Then I know enough." "Holmes?" I exclaimed. "You mean Reginald Blackthorne did not die naturally?" "No." Holmes turned slightly toward me. "He was poisoned." Forsyth lowered his revolver in astonishment. "But Felton declared heart failure, precisely because the poison simulated cardiac collapse." Adrian stared intensely at Holmes now. "How did you discover it?" "The candle grease." Blackthorne blinked. "What?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "In the tower chamber I found traces of burned bitter almond oil within the fireplace." "Ash," I started. "Cyanide." "An uncommon derivative introduced through heated vapour." Holmes folded his arms. Reginald died terrified because he realised too late that he had been trapped inside a sealed room, filling gradually with poison. Forsyth swore softly. "Good God." Adrian looked toward Ravenswood Hall, looming dark against the sky. "And Edmund, he is no murderer." The scarred man closed his eyes briefly. "I thought—" "Yes," said Holmes quietly, "which is precisely why someone encouraged you to think so." Before another word could be spoken, hurried footsteps approached across the moor behind us. Marcham emerged breathless from the darkness. "Mr. Holmes?" "Well, "It's Mr. Blackthorne, sir. Alive? Yes, but injured." Holmes nodded once as though confirming something already expected. "Describe the injury." "A knife wound to the shoulder." "Excellent." Marcham stared. "Excellent, sir. A clumsy wound is preferable to a fatal one." Holmes turned back toward Adrian. "You see, the attack was staged to complete the illusion." Adrian's face hardened. "By whom?" Holmes' expression became very grave. "That," said he, "is the final question." At that instant the raven upon Adrian's shoulder suddenly shrieked. Not a croak, a warning. Holmes spun instantly. So, a figure had appeared atop the stone ridge overlooking us. Tall, motionless, wrapped in a dark coat fluttering violently in the wind. Moonlight struck metal in one raised hand. A pistol. "Down!" Holmes shouted. The shot rang across the moor. I saw sparks leap from the stones beside Holmes' head. Forsyth fired instantly in return. The figure vanished behind the ridge. Holmes was already running. "Watson, this way." We scrambled upward across the rocks. The ridge beyond descended sharply toward a marshy hollow, half concealed by mist. For several seconds we glimpsed the fleeing gunman moving rapidly through the fog. Then another shot cracked through the darkness. Forsyth cursed violently and stumbled. "My arm!" Holmes pressed onward without pause. The fugitive reached the marsh edge. Then something extraordinary occurred. The ground beneath him gave way. There came a cry, brief and terrible. The figure vanished instantly into the black mire. We reached the spot moments later, only to find swirling mud and stagnant water. Nothing more. Holmes stood breathing hard at the edge of the bog. "Quicksand," said Adrian, hoarsely behind us. Forsyth clutched his wounded arm grimly. "You mean the bastard drowned?" Holmes stared silently into the black marsh. Then slowly he bent and picked something from the reeds. A woman's glove. He examined it beneath the moonlight, and for the first time since the case began, Sherlock Holmes looked genuinely shocked. "Impossible," he whispered. Chapter X. The woman in the marsh. The wind swept mournfully across the moor, while Holmes stood motionless at the edge of the black mire, the woman's glove dangling from his fingers. I had known him long enough to recognize the significance of that expression upon his face. Sherlock Holmes was not a man easily astonished. When genuine surprise overtook him, the matter was never trivial. Forsyth, pale from loss of blood, yet stubbornly upright, stared impatiently. "Well," Holmes turned the glove slowly beneath the moonlight. "Lambskin," said he absently. "Excellent quality. London manufacture." "What of it?" demanded Adrian. Holmes lifted his eyes. "It belongs to Clara Whitmore." The words fell into silence like stones dropped into deep water. Adrian Blackthorne took an involuntary step backward. "No." Holmes held out the glove. "Observe the embroidered initials." Indeed, faint silver stitching marked the inner wrist. C.W. Forsyth frowned heavily. "You think the girl fired upon us?" "I think," said Holmes carefully, "that she was present." Marcham crossed himself nervously. "Miss Clara?" "Impossible, sir." Yet even as he spoke, uncertainty clouded his expression. Holmes remained gazing toward the dark mire. The shooter knew the marsh paths poorly, another indication that panic overcame planning. Adrian's scarred face had grown rigid. "She cannot be involved. You speak with remarkable confidence." The younger Blackthorne met Holmes' gaze steadily. "Because Clara is incapable of murder." Holmes' eyes narrowed faintly. "Ah." It was astonishing how much meaning Holmes could compress into a single syllable. "You know her well, then?" A silence followed. At last Adrian answered quietly. "I knew her as a child." Holmes slipped the glove into his coat. "Interesting." He turned abruptly toward the hall. "We return immediately." The atmosphere inside Ravenswood Hall had changed yet again upon our arrival. Panic now mingled openly with suspicion. Servants whispered in frightened groups throughout the corridors. Dr. Felton had arrived once more, and was presently attending Edmund Blackthorne within the tower chamber, where the supposed attack had occurred. Holmes entered the room without ceremony. Blackthorne sat propped against pillows beside the hearth, his face pale but conscious. One sleeve had been cut away to expose a bandaged wound upon the shoulder. Dr. Felton rose irritably. "My patient requires rest, Mr. Holmes." My patient, said Holmes coolly, requires honesty. The physician flushed. I assure you the wound is genuine. I never doubted it. Holmes approached the bed. You were alone when attacked? Blackthorne nodded weakly. Yes. You saw the assailant? Only briefly. A man, I think so. Holmes' gaze sharpened. You think? The room was dark, yet you fired your revolver. Blackthorne hesitated. Yes. Holmes extended his hand. The weapon, if you please. After brief reluctance, Blackthorne surrendered a revolver from the bedside table. Holmes examined it swiftly. One chamber discharged. He sniffed the barrel lightly. Recently. Then his eyes drifted toward the wound. A shallow angle. Dr. Felton stiffened. What exactly are you implying? Holmes ignored him. Mr. Blackthorne. Did your assailant speak? No. Did you hear movement beforehand? A sound in the passage. Wings, perhaps. Blackthorne looked sharply at him. Yes. Holmes nodded slowly, as expected. He turned abruptly toward the physician. You may leave us now, Doctor, Felton bristled. I protest strongly. You also misdiagnosed murder as heart failure, said Holmes calmly. The physician went white. What? Holmes stepped closer. Reginald Blackthorne was poisoned. The room fell utterly silent. Dr. Felton stared in open horror. That is absurd. No. Holmes' voice had become razor-sharp. What is absurd is that you failed to detect cyanide vapours in a locked chamber. Felton's hands trembled visibly. I examined the body thoroughly. Did you? Holmes fixed him with cold intensity. Or were you persuaded not to examine too thoroughly? The doctor flushed darkly. You insult me, sir. If accuracy insults you, the fault lies elsewhere. Felton seized his medical bag angrily. I refuse to remain here. You may refuse many things, Holmes replied softly, but before morning Scotland Yard shall undoubtedly wish to question you. The physician departed in visible agitation. Blackthorne stared after him. You suspect Felton? I suspect weakness. Holmes seated himself beside the fire. Now, Mr. Blackthorne, let us dispense with theatre. Who wounded you? The man recoiled. I told you. You lied. Holmes' tone cracked like a whip. The blade entered from an impossible angle for an external attack. Either you stabbed yourself, or someone standing extremely close performed the service. Blackthorne's face collapsed inward suddenly, all resistance draining from him. You do not understand, he whispered. Then enlighten me. The man buried his face briefly in one trembling hand. I thought Adrian meant to kill me, yet he did not. No. Holmes leaned forward. Who entered the chamber tonight? For several seconds Blackthorne remained silent. Then he spoke in a broken voice. Clara. Even I started. Holmes alone showed no visible surprise. She confessed. No. God help her, no. Blackthorne looked utterly wretched now. She came to warn me. About what? That someone intended another death tonight? Holmes' eyes flashed. And then she heard movement outside the chamber. He swallowed hard. She became terrified. We struggled over the revolver. The wound occurred accidentally. Yes. Then why conceal her presence? Blackthorne laughed bitterly. Because she fled immediately afterward, and because I realized how it would appear. Holmes stood slowly. At last, said he, we approach truth. Before Blackthorne could answer, hurried footsteps sounded once more in the corridor. Miss Whitmore herself entered the chamber. She had plainly been crying. Upon seeing Adrian Blackthorne standing near the doorway behind us, she stopped as though struck. For several seconds neither spoke. Then she whispered, You are alive. Adrian removed his hat slowly. Yes. The quiet emotion between them was unmistakable. Holmes observed both with keen interest. You expected otherwise, Miss Whitmore. Tears filled her eyes. They told us he was dead. Holmes folded his arms. And yet you recognized him immediately upon his return. She looked down. Yes. From the beginning? Yes. Blackthorne stared between them in astonishment. You knew Adrian was here? Clara clasped her hands tightly. He contacted me 3 weeks ago. Forsyth uttered a violent oath. Then why in heaven's name conceal it? Because he feared Reginald. Adrian stepped forward quietly. My brother stole the western lands after our father's death. I returned only to recover proof. Holmes nodded toward the hidden codicil. The concealed document. Yes. Clara looked desperately toward Holmes. Adrian did not kill Reginald. I know. Then who did? At last, Sherlock Holmes moved to the centre of the chamber and stood silent for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice had become extraordinarily precise. The murderer, said he, understood three things very clearly. Everyone watched him intently. First, that Ravenswood Hall already possessed a history of fear and superstition. Second, that Adrian Blackthorne's disappearance could be exploited. Third, that Reginald Blackthorne was dying of terror long before poison ever touched him. He paced slowly before the hearth. The Raven legend was revived deliberately. Blood symbols appeared. Nocturnal sounds haunted the galleries. Hidden passages produced ghostly sightings. Adrian himself, moving secretly through the hall, unknowingly strengthened the illusion. Adrian clenched his jaw. I frightened Reginald intentionally. Yes, said Holmes coldly. You behaved foolishly, but not murderously. Holmes stopped suddenly. Meanwhile, the true killer remained close beside the victim, trusted, invisible. A dreadful silence descended. Blackthorne whispered. Who? Holmes turned toward the door. Come in, Colonel Forsyth. The colonel entered slowly from the corridor beyond. His wounded arm rested in a sling. Yet it was not the injury which arrested my attention. It was the expression upon Holmes' face. Cold, final. Forsyth looked around the room heavily. You sent for me? Yes. Holmes' eyes never left him, because the game is over. Chaptered Holmes explains the Raven. No man who has not witnessed Sherlock Holmes at the climax of one of his investigations can fully appreciate the extraordinary transformation which came over him in such moments. The languid dreamer vanished entirely. In his place emerged a figure of terrible intellectual force, cold, precise, and utterly relentless. So it was now. The atmosphere within the tower chamber had become suffocatingly tense. Clara Whitmore stood pale beside the hearth, one trembling hand pressed against her throat. Adrian Blackthorne remained motionless near the doorway, his scarred features rigid with restrained emotion. Edmund Blackthorne sat upright despite his wound, staring between Holmes and Colonel Forsyth with growing bewilderment. The colonel alone appeared outwardly calm. You accuse me, he said quietly. Holmes folded his arms. I state facts. Accusation is merely their consequence. Forsyth gave a short, humourless laugh. Then let us hear these miraculous facts. You shall. Holmes turned slightly toward us all. From the beginning this case presented one central contradiction. Reginald Blackthorne died in terror. But terror itself did not kill him. He paced slowly before the fire. The murderer, therefore, required two separate mechanisms. First, psychological torment. Second, poison administered under conditions appearing supernatural. Forsyth shrugged. An interesting theory. A correct one. Holmes stopped beside the table. The Raven legend provided ideal camouflage. Anonymous warnings, blood symbols, sounds in hidden passages. Even the trained bird itself. Clara stared. The Raven was real. Entirely. Holmes smiled faintly. A remarkably intelligent creature trained to fly between concealed openings in the hall. Adrian frowned. But who trained it? Holmes looked directly at Forsyth, a former army officer stationed for years in India and Burma, regions where ravens and crows are frequently domesticated. The colonel's expression hardened slightly. Circumstantial. Everything begins circumstantially, Holmes continued calmly. The bird created auditory terror, wings overhead, scratching at windows, sudden appearances in locked corridors, combined with Adrian's secret movements through the passages. The effect upon Reginald became devastating. Edmund Blackthorne stared toward Adrian. You truly returned only to recover the codicil? Yes. Adrian's voice was bitter. I wish to ruin Reginald publicly, not kill him. Holmes nodded. And your presence unknowingly assisted the real murderer. Forsyth's eyes narrowed. You still prove nothing. Patience. Holmes withdrew the revolver recovered from the hidden chamber. This weapon belonged originally to Colonel Forsyth. The soldier stiffened visibly. I never claimed otherwise. No, more interestingly, the cigarette ash found within the concealed chamber proved identical to the Colonel's preferred Eastern tobacco. Forsyth laughed harshly. 100 men smoke trichinopoly. Not at Ravenswood Hall. Holmes stepped closer. Furthermore, the kennel dogs recognized your scent. They became agitated because they knew someone moved repeatedly through the hidden passages at night. The Colonel's wounded hand tightened unconsciously. You build fantasies from scraps. Holmes' voice sharpened suddenly. Then let us discuss the poison. Silence fell again. You possessed military experience with chemical compounds uncommon in England. During your service abroad, you encountered fumigant cyanide preparations used against vermin in enclosed structures. Forsyth's face altered almost imperceptibly. Holmes saw it instantly. Reginald Blackthorne died inside a sealed chamber with candles burning low. The poison was introduced gradually through the fireplace flue from the hidden wall passage beyond. My breath caught. Good heavens! Holmes nodded toward me. The bitter almond traces in the ash revealed everything. Forsyth spoke very quietly now. You cannot prove I administered it. Oh yes, said Holmes softly. I can. He reached into his pocket and produced the silver raven brooch. This belonged to Lady Blackthorne, yet it was discovered inside your hidden chamber. The Colonel's composure flickered for the first time. You assume too much. No, Holmes' eyes glittered. Clara Whitmore visited the passages because you persuaded her Adrian might still live. Clara gasped softly. You knew? My dear young lady, affection leaves remarkably visible footprints. He turned back toward Forsyth. You manipulated her sympathy to learn Adrian's movements. Then you used Adrian's return as the perfect phantom upon which to project the crimes. Edmund Blackthorne looked utterly stunned. But why? He whispered. At last Holmes answered the question which had haunted Ravenswood Hall from the beginning. Because Colonel Forsyth was ruined. The soldier's face became expressionless. Holmes continued mercilessly. Gambling debts, failed investments in London, quiet loans from Reginald Blackthorne himself. Blackthorne stared. Reginald never mentioned such matters. Proud men seldom advertise weakness. Holmes moved toward the fire. Forsyth required money desperately. Yet Reginald intended altering his will after discovering certain irregularities concerning estate accounts. Adrian looked sharply up. You forged documents. Forsyth smiled faintly. At last someone intelligent speaks. Clara recoiled. Julian. Yes, said he bitterly. Julian, the faithful family friend. Holmes watched him steadily. You expected Reginald's death to implicate Adrian eventually. No, said Forsyth quietly. I expected the curse to explain everything. For a moment the only sound was the crackling fire. Then Forsyth laughed softly. It nearly worked. You made one serious error, said Holmes. The woman's glove, Forsyth asked. No. Holmes's expression became razor-sharp. You wounded Edmund Blackthorne too carefully. The Colonel blinked. A killer growing desperate strikes to kill. Yet Edmund survived because you merely needed another attack to continue the illusion. Edmund Blackthorne stared in horror. You stabbed me? Yes. Forsyth spoke without emotion now. You struggled like an idiot and spoiled the angle. Clara uttered a low cry. Holmes stepped subtly between them. You also underestimated Sarah. The Colonel's eyes flickered briefly. She saw you carrying the raven through the gallery. Forsyth shrugged faintly. She was never meant to survive. Adrian moved suddenly forward with clenched fists. You damned devil! Holmes' voice cracked like a pistol shot. Stand back! Something in his tone halted everyone instantly. Forsyth's expression had changed again. Calmness returned. Cold calmness. I wondered when you would arrive at it, Holmes. You knew I would. Yes, the Colonel smiled faintly. That is why I attempted the marsh. Holmes' eyes narrowed. You intended to kill us all there. Only if necessary. His unwounded hand drifted slowly toward his coat pocket. In the same instant, Holmes moved. The speed of it astonished me, even after years beside him. He sprang forward, seized Forsyth's wrist, and twisted violently. A small Derringer pistol clattered across the floor. Adrian and I rushed simultaneously toward the colonel. Yet even as we seized him, Forsyth began laughing. Not wildly, quietly, hopelessly. "It changes nothing," he murmured. "It changes everything," said Holmes coldly. Forsyth looked toward the ancient windows where dawn's first grey light now touched the storm clouds beyond the moor. "Do you know what Ravenswood truly is, Holmes? A decaying estate burdened by vanity? No." The colonel's smile became strangely sad. "It is a tomb. Every blackthorn destroys the next." Holmes released him to my custody, an observation interesting chiefly because you hastened the process. Marcham appeared breathlessly in the doorway, accompanied by 2 frightened servants. Holmes pointed calmly toward Forsyth. "Kindly secure the colonel until the police arrive." No one moved immediately. The sheer collapse of illusion seemed almost too sudden for comprehension. At last, Forsyth extended his hands quietly. "Very well." As the servants led him away, he paused beside Clara. "I did care for you once," he said softly. The girl turned away without answering. Silence settled heavily after his departure. Edmund Blackthorne sank back weakly into his chair. "Dear God." Holmes lit his pipe with steady fingers. "The phrase appears popular at Ravenswood." Adrian stood staring into the fire. "All these years," he said quietly. "All this hatred." Holmes exhaled smoke thoughtfully. "Hate is among the most expensive luxuries known to man." Clara crossed slowly toward Adrian. "You should have returned openly." "I thought no one would believe me." Holmes smiled faintly. "In fairness, your methods were spectacularly unhelpful." To my astonishment, Adrian actually laughed. A weary laugh, but genuine. Outside, the first pale rays of morning crept over the moorlands surrounding Ravenswood Hall. The long nightmare had ended at last. Chapter 12. The silence above Ravenswood. 3 days later, the shadow hanging over Ravenswood Hall had begun, at last, to lift. The storm clouds which had so long shrouded the moors had broken apart into cold, clear skies, and for the first time since our arrival, I saw the estate beneath full daylight. The transformation proved remarkable. What had appeared sinister and oppressive under rain and darkness now revealed traces of faded grandeur instead. The ancient stone terraces overlooked wide stretches of heath, touched silver by autumn frost, while distant woods glimmered softly beneath the morning sun. Yet, despite the improved weather, the events at Ravenswood had left deep marks upon every inhabitant of the Hall. Colonel Julian Forsyth had been conveyed under guard to London after making a full confession before the local magistrate. Holmes, though outwardly indifferent to the matter, had extracted every detail with his usual ruthless thoroughness. The colonel's scheme, once exposed, appeared both ingenious and profoundly cynical. He had learned years earlier of the concealed codicil favouring Adrian Blackthorne, and realised immediately the possibilities created by the younger brother's mysterious disappearance. When mounting debts and impending ruin threatened him, he conceived the idea of exploiting Ravenswood's old superstitions to mask murder beneath the appearance of hereditary doom. Adrian's secret return to the Hall had provided the final piece necessary for the deception. He could scarcely believe his good fortune. Holmes remarked to me on the morning following the confession, "A living ghost wandering conveniently through hidden passages. Providence occasionally displays a theatrical sense of humour." Reginald Blackthorne's growing paranoia had done the rest. The false raven symbols, the trained bird, the hidden movements through the hall, the manipulated sounds overhead. All had gradually broken down the elder, Blackthorne's nerves until he became vulnerable to Forsyth's final act. The poison itself, introduced through the concealed flue passage, while Reginald sat trapped within the tower chamber, had simulated sudden cardiac failure almost perfectly. It was the fear that concealed the murder, Holmes explained. Everyone observed the terror upon the victim's face, and ceased thinking thereafter. Doctor. Felton's incompetence had nearly completed the deception entirely. "I dislike fools more than villains," Holmes remarked dryly. "Villains occasionally possess imagination." As for Adrian Blackthorne, his position remained more complicated. Though entirely innocent of murder, His deliberate haunting of Ravenswood Hall had undeniably contributed to the tragedy. Yet even Scotland Yard recognised the extraordinary circumstances involved, and Holmes himself intervened decisively on his behalf. Adrian behaved melodramatically, he informed Inspector Gregson, who arrived from London on the second afternoon. But melodrama is not a hanging offence, though perhaps it ought to be. The younger Blackthorne accepted Holmes's rebukes with unexpected humility. On our final evening at Ravenswood, I encountered him standing alone upon the western terrace, overlooking the moor, where we had pursued him through darkness only nights before. The raven sat quietly beside him upon the stone balustrade. In daylight the creature appeared less sinister than intelligent, its black feathers gleaming blue beneath the lowering sun. "You keep it still," said I. Adrian glanced toward the bird. "It followed me for years in India after I rescued it wounded." A faint smile touched his scarred features. Rather fitting, perhaps. We were both creatures people preferred dead. I hesitated before speaking again. "You intend remaining at Ravenswood?" For a time, his gaze drifted toward the hall. "Edmund has asked me to help restore the estate." This surprised me considerably. The reconciliation seemed sudden. Near death clarifies many useless grievances. He fell silent briefly. "Reginald destroyed himself long before Forsyth killed him. Hatred poisons families slowly." There was truth in this which even Holmes might have approved. Miss Clara Whitmore, meanwhile, had recovered much of her composure. The strain of recent events remained visible upon her. Yet the fearful uncertainty haunting her during our first days at Ravenswood had vanished entirely. I could not fail to observe, moreover, that she and Adrian Blackthorne now spent considerable time together, in quiet conversation among the gardens and terraces. Holmes naturally noticed this long before I did. "You perceive romance, Watson," said he one morning over breakfast. "I perceive restoration of equilibrium. You reduce affection to mathematics. Affection frequently behaves mathematically." "How so?" "Two lonely people with shared history plus mutual danger commonly produce attachment." I laughed. "There are moments, Holmes, when you speak of human beings as chemical compounds. They are considerably less reliable." Despite his tone, however, I detected genuine satisfaction beneath his customary irony. Holmes was not insensitive to human happiness. He merely distrusted sentimentality. On the final afternoon before our departure, Edmund Blackthorne requested a private audience with Holmes in the library. I joined them shortly afterward, and found our host standing beside the fire, holding a sealed envelope. "You have saved more than my life, Mr. Holmes," said he quietly. "You have saved Ravenswood itself." Holmes waved aside the compliment impatiently. "I merely removed fungus from rotting timber. Whether the structure survives depends upon yourselves." Blackthorne extended the envelope. "Nevertheless, I ask you to accept this." Holmes took it reluctantly. "A professional fee, a debt." Holmes slipped the envelope unopened into his pocket. "Very well," Blackthorne hesitated. "There is one thing I still do not understand." "Yes?" "Why did Forsyth attempt to kill us upon the moor after his scheme had already begun collapsing?" Holmes lit his pipe thoughtfully before answering. "Because intelligent criminals become most dangerous at the moment they recognize failure." He glanced toward the darkening windows. "Until then they believe themselves superior to consequence." That evening we departed Ravenswood Hall beneath cold, clear skies. As our carriage rolled slowly down the long avenue of yew trees, I looked back once toward the ancient manor, silhouetted against the fading sunset. The western tower no longer appeared ominous, only old. Beside me Holmes sat wrapped in silence, long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You are thinking of the case," said I. "I am thinking of fear." "In what sense?" Holmes watched the moorland drifting past. "Fear is among the most useful instruments ever devised. Entire religions, governments, and families have been built upon it." "You speak rather grimly." "Reality frequently disappoints optimists." After several miles, he added quietly, "Yet courage remains, equally infectious." I glanced at him in surprise. "From you that sounds almost philosophical." Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Watson, prolonged exposure to ancient houses occasionally produces temporary introspection. Night had fallen fully by the time our train approached London. The familiar haze of smoke and gaslight spread gradually across the horizon, replacing the lonely darkness of the Norfolk moors with the restless pulse of the city. Holmes appeared already half withdrawn into his own thoughts again. As we entered Baker Street at last, he paused briefly upon the threshold of 2T1B and listened. To what? I asked. The silence, I laughed. After Ravenswood Hall, silence should be welcome. On the contrary, said Holmes softly. Silence merely means the next problem has not yet announced itself. Mrs. Hudson entered bustling warmly from below. Welcome home, gentlemen. Holmes removed his coat slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Has anything occurred in our absence? Only a gentleman waiting since afternoon, Mr. Holmes. Holmes raised one eyebrow. Indeed? Yes, sir. Foreign-looking gentleman. Most anxious to see you. Holmes sighed with theatrical resignation. You perceive, Watson, London conspires against rest. A faint smile touched his lips as he crossed once more toward the fire-lit sitting room of Baker Street. And thus ended the strange affair of Ravenswood Hall, a case in which fear itself became both weapon and disguise, and where the shadow of a raven nearly concealed murder beneath the appearance of ancient doom. Even now, years later, I cannot hear the distant beating of wings on a storm-heavy night without recalling the dark galleries of that lonely manor upon the moor, and the cold, clear voice of Sherlock Holmes cutting through superstition like a lantern through fog. Epilogue: Holmes and the Last Feather. Several months passed before the affair of Ravenswood Hall returned unexpectedly to my thoughts. London had settled once more into its accustomed rhythm of smoke, rain, and restless humanity. Holmes occupied himself during that winter with a succession of cases, varying considerably in merit. From the recovery of certain diplomatic papers for the Foreign Office to the exposure of an exceedingly foolish clairvoyant in Kensington, whom Holmes described as a charlatan of unusually mediocre imagination. Yet, despite these distractions, I occasionally observed that the Ravenswood case lingered in his mind longer than most. One bitter January evening I found him seated alone beside the fire at Baker Street, turning a black feather slowly between his fingers. The ravens? I asked. Holmes glanced up. Indeed, you kept it. I keep many things. The firelight cast sharp shadows across his lean features. Outside, sleet rattled against the windows, while the muffled roar of London drifted dimly upward from Baker Street below. You rarely preserve mementos, said I. Rarely. He tossed the feather lightly upon the table. The Ravenswood affair interested me, because the central mechanism was neither poison nor violence, but fear. Precisely. Holmes leaned back thoughtfully. Most criminals attempt to conceal truth. Forsyth attempted to replace it entirely. I lit my pipe. You almost sound impressed. I am always impressed by intelligence, said Holmes calmly, even misdirected intelligence. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered carrying the Evening Post. A letter for you, Doctor, and one for Mr. Holmes. Holmes broke his envelope carelessly. Then his expression altered very slightly. Ah, what is it? Without answering, he handed me the letter. The paper bore the crest of Ravenswood Hall. My dear Mr. Holmes, you once remarked that old houses preserve echoes longer than living men. I believe now you were correct. The western wing has at last been reopened fully. During restoration work yesterday we uncovered another concealed chamber, previously unknown even to Adrian. Within it stood an old carved perch fixed to the stone wall, and surrounded by black feathers countless years old. It appears the legend of the raven may have begun far earlier than any of us imagined. Miss Whitmore and Adrian send their gratitude. Ravenswood grows quieter each week. Yours sincerely, Edmund Blackthorne. I lowered the letter slowly. So the symbol existed before Forsyth. Holmes smiled faintly, almost certainly. You are not surprised. My dear Watson, nearly every superstition contains a fragment of forgotten reality buried beneath generations of embellishment. He extended one long arm toward the violin resting near the mantel. The difficulty lies in separating the fragment from the embellishment. I studied him thoughtfully. There is one point you never fully explained. Only one. The sounds above the gallery ceiling, the scratching, the wings. I leaned forward. How precisely were they produced? Holmes' eyes gleamed with amusement. A combination of methods. Hidden chords, trained movement routes for the bird, and metal hooks dragged across timber beams from the concealed loft. So simple, all effective deceptions are. He drew the violin beneath his chin. The human imagination performs the greater labour. Soft notes began rising through the room, melancholy, wandering phrases unlike the fierce improvisations Holmes often produced during active cases. You know, said I after a time, there were moments at Ravenswood when even I doubted reason. Holmes lowered the bow slightly. That, said he quietly, is why reason matters. The music resumed. Outside, the winter fog thickened across London streets, while within Baker Street, the fire burned steadily against the gloom. And as I watched, Holmes seated there, in profile beside the flickering light, violin murmuring softly through the smoke-filled room, I reflected once more upon the singular privilege fate had granted me, for I had not merely observed the workings of a remarkable mind. I had witnessed, again and again, the triumph of clear thought over darkness, whether that darkness wore the mask of superstition, fear, or the hidden corruption of the human heart. And somewhere far beyond London, upon the silent Norfolk moors, Ravenswood Hall stood beneath cold stars at last, untroubled by the beating of unseen wings.